Ukrainian forces have blitzed through Russia's gains
in a lightning counteroffensive,
forcing Russian forces to retreat.
The major breakthrough for Ukraine, and it marks a new phase in the war.
This phase was essentially the Russians attempting to force the Ukrainian government to surrender.
Thousands of Ukrainian civilians that have been trapped under Russian occupation for months.
I think this was a very well done. I am confident in saying that the shoe is more on the other foot now with Ukraine, and they have clearly demonstrated that they can and fully intend to take this war into 2023 and drive out the occupying Russian forces.
In other news at this hour, with visuals of footages of the Russian-Ukraine war
Возвращайся домой. Я тоже вас люблю.
War is hypothesized to have a negative political impact through three main mechanisms: destruction from any peacetime political and economic reform agenda, military defeat and disruption, and associated weakening or militarization of state authority and post-war economic isolation. Economic impacts of the Russia and Ukraine war in the world today. The Russia-Ukraine war is having an outsized impact on the global supply chain, impeding the flow of goods, fueling dramatic cost increases and product shortages, and creating catastrophic food shortages around the world. Disruption of the Ukraine war pushes up prices. Just when most of the world was recovering from the economic downturn caused by the pandemic, Vladimir Putin launches invasion that new disruption reversed the recovery in some places and pushed up the cost of living every way. The war also continues to have a major effect on the global markets and food supply. Ukraine's inability to export grain throughout the first 5 months of the conflict worsened the global hunger crisis, with catastrophic impacts throughout the world. The conflict threatens to squeeze energy and commodities markets further. Russia is the world's third oil producer, the second natural gas producer among the top 5 producers of steel, nickel, and aluminum. It is also the largest wheat exporter in the world, almost 20% of global trade. On its side, Ukraine is a key producer of corn, wheat, sunflowers, and is amongst the top 10 producers of sugar beet, barley, soya, and rapeseed. On the day the invasion began, financial markets around the world fell sharply, and the prices of oil, natural gas, metals, and food commodities surged. Following the latest developments, Brent oil prices breached USD 100 per barrel for the first time since 2014, while Europe's TTF gas prices surged at a record EUR 192 on March 4. While high commodity prices were one of the risks already identified as potentially disruptive to the recovery, the escalation of the conflict increases the likelihood that commodity prices will remain higher for much longer. In turn, it intensifies the threat of long-lasting high inflation, thereby increasing the risk of inflation and social unrest in the both advanced and emerging countries. Automotive, transport, chemicals are most vulnerable sectors. The crisis is obviously strongly impacting an already strained automotive sector due to various shortages and high commodity and raw materials prices, metals, semiconductors, cobalt, lithium, and magnesium. Ukrainian automotive factories supply major car makers in Western Europe. Some announced the stoppage of factories in Europe, while other plants around the world are already planning outages due to chip shortage. Airlines and maritime freight companies will also suffer from higher fuel prices, airlines being the most at risk. First, fuel is estimated to account for about a third of their total cost. Second, European countries. The US and Canada have forbidden the access to their territories to Russian airlines, and in turn, Russia has banned European and Canadian aircrafts from its airspace. This means higher costs since airlines will have to take longer routes. Eventually, airlines have little room for rising costs as they continue to face lower revenues due to impact of the pandemic. Rail freight will also be impacted. European companies are forbidden to do business with Russian railways, which will likely disrupt freight activity between Asia and Europe, transiting through Russia. We also expect feedstock for petrochemicals to be more expensive and the soaring prices of natural gas to impact the fertilizer markets, hence the whole agri-food industry. Deep recession ahead for the Russian economy. The Russian economy will be in great difficulty in 2022, following the deep recession. To face updated GDP forecast for 2022. This has led us to downgrade the country's risk assessment from B to D. Sanctions notably targets major Russian banks, the Russian central banks. The Russian sovereign deep selected Russia public officials and oligarchs, and the export control of high-tech components to Russia. These measures put considerable downward pressure on the Russia ruble, which has already plummeted and will drive a surge in consumer price inflation. Russia has built up relatively strong financials, a low-level public external debt, a recurrent account surplus, as well as a substantial foreign reserves. However, the freeze imposed on Western depository countries in the latter prevents the Russian central bank from deploying them and reduces the effectiveness of the Russian response. The Russian economy could benefit from higher prices for commodities, especially for its energy exports. However, EU countries announced their intention to limit their imports from Russia. In the industrial sector, restricted access to Western-produced semiconductors, computers, telecommunication, automation, and information security equipment will be harmful, given the importance of this boosts the Russian mining and manufacturing sectors. European economies are the most at risk. Because of its dependence on Russian oil and natural gas, Europe appears to be the region most exposed to the consequences of this conflict. Replacing all Russian natural gas supply to Europe is impossible in the short to medium run, and current price levels will have a significant effect on inflation. At the time of writing, with a barrel of Brent trading above $125 and the natural gas future is suggesting prices durably above. COFACE estimates at least 1.5 percentage point of additional inflation in 2022, which would erode household consumption, and together with the expected fall in businesses, investment, and exports, lower GDP growth with approximately 1 percentage point. While Germany, Italy, or some countries in the Central and Eastern European region are more dependent on Russian natural gas, the trade interdependence of Eurozone countries suggests a general slowdown. On top of that, we estimated a complete cut of Russian natural gas flows to Europe would raise the cost of 4 percentage points in 2022, which would bring annual GDP growth close to zero, more probably in negative territory depending on demand destruction management.
On September 6th, the Ukrainian army launched an attack on the town of Balaklia. It had been held by the Russian army for more than 6 months, but by September 8th, the Ukrainian army had recaptured it, and they were just getting started. Over the next few days, Ukrainian forces swept through this Russian-held territory with astounding speed.
Ukrainian forces have blitzed through Russia's gains
in a lightning counteroffensive,
forcing Russian forces to retreat.
As of September 14th, Ukraine claims it recaptured nearly 8,000 square kilometers of Russian-held territory and liberated dozens of towns. It's a major breakthrough for Ukraine, and it marks a new phase in the war. So, how did Ukraine pull off such a stunning attack, and how does it change the war? It's useful to think of the war in Ukraine as having 3 main phases so far. The first began when Russia invaded in February 2022. The Russian military swept into Ukraine through the north, east, and south, and immediately clashed with the Ukrainian army.
This phase was essentially the Russians attempting to force the Ukrainian government to surrender.
This is Mason Clark, a Russia analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, an American think tank.
Ukrainian forces at the time were in large part outgunned.
The most intense fighting took place in a few major cities like Kharkiv, Mariupol, Kherson, and outside the capital, Kyiv. But by April, a few weeks into the war, Russia had failed to capture Kyiv or Kharkiv. It did control a large swath of territory, though, and continued to fight the Ukrainian army on three main fronts: in the northeast, in the east, and in the south, where it did control Kherson. That's when the second phase began. From about April to August, this map changed very little. Russia, for the most part, stopped conducting large, sweeping attacks, and instead relied on its artillery to pound Ukrainian positions. But the Russian army was in bad shape. The US government estimates that as many as 80,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded.
It was very, very devastating for them, particularly since the losses they were taking early in the war were in the best of the Russian military. The easy comparison is by this summer, the Russians had lost more men than the Soviets did in nearly a decade of the war in Afghanistan.
So during the summer, Russia used the time to recruit more soldiers, but it didn't go well.
A fascinating element of this is that the Kremlin still is calling this a special military operation. It cannot be referred to as a war. That actually matters because the Russians haven't called up conscripts for this invasion, and instead they're trying to fill these gaps with these various ad hoc methods.
The Russians have had to hire more mercenaries and offer payments to prisoners. They've even raised the age limit to allow men over 40 to join the army. And Russia sent many of these men with little training to the front lines.
So it's led to a steady drop-off in the quality of Russian personnel throughout the war.
But while Russia struggled to rebuild its army, Ukraine had the opposite problem.
There was actually a sort of a bottleneck in May where they had too many recruits and not enough instructors to train them, which is a very good problem to have.
With the help from its Western allies, Ukraine was able to quickly train lots of these men before sending them to the front.
That has really helped the Ukrainian military not just produce more soldiers, but very effective soldiers, better than the Russians.
By the end of August, they were ready for the next phase of the war, their own attack. Throughout the summer, Ukrainian leaders talked a lot about their plans to launch an attack, and they made it pretty clear that they would strike here, Kherson, key to control of the south. Ukraine moved many of its troops into position near the city and used their most advanced artillery to hit the Russians for weeks. They were forcing the undermanned Russian army to make a choice.
They had to pick somewhere to send forces, and they picked Kherson.
When the Russians moved troops to Kherson, they left the northeast vulnerable, since it was mostly guarded by those inexperienced soldiers. So when Ukraine did start their attack in early September, they didn't hit much resistance there. Almost as soon as Ukraine's soldiers began the attack, the Russian forces began to flee. These are piles of weapons and ammunition left behind by Russian troops near Kharkiv. They also left trucks, tanks, and artillery behind. And this is a Russian tank crew frantically fleeing before crashing into a tree.
The Russians were running away and withdrawing faster than the Ukrainians were keeping up with them.
While the Russians retreated, Ukraine took over all this territory, which included some important towns. Izium was a Russian supply dump, and Kupiansk was a crucial railway hub, useful for moving troops and supplies. They've also freed thousands of Ukrainian civilians that have been trapped under Russian occupation for months.
I think this was a very well done, opportunistic attack that went just incredibly well for the Ukrainian military.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is still attacking Kherson and making some progress. But the attack in Kharkiv has begun a third phase in the war, where Ukraine this time has the momentum.
There's a long road ahead. The Russians are going to try and replace these further catastrophic losses with likely diminishing returns, but I am confident in saying that the shoe is more on the other foot now, with Ukrainian forces having the initiative of choosing where the next major battle of the war will occur. And they have clearly demonstrated that they can and fully intend to take this war into 2023 and drive out the occupying Russian forces.